Iceland. Chancellor, did you have a meeting with the head of the Icelandic Financial Authority at the beginning of September?
Yes, amongst others, yes.
It was 4 weeks before their banks failed.
I think, if I remember rightly, it would have been the 2nd or 3rd of September. But there was a minister for business who had some responsibility for business banking. He brought with him the equivalent of the head of the Icelandic FSA, someone from the Icelandic Central Bank, and a couple of other civil servants.
So you knew 4 weeks before the banks failed that there were some serious problems there?
It had been a matter of speculation in newspapers for several months that there had been concerns about Iceland, and by extension there had been a lot of comment about the banks. Perhaps it would be helpful if I told you the reason for the meeting, and that is that the authorities, the FSA principally, had been keen to ensure that the Icelandic authorities made sure that the subsidiary, the branch of Landesbanki, was made into a subsidiary so that we could regulate it in this country. And the Icelandic the minister and his colleagues at that time wanted to assure us that they were on the case and that they were looking after matters.
We'll come to Landsbanki. Why did you tell BBC Radio on the 8th of October, and I quote, "The Icelandic government, believe it or not, have told me yesterday they have no intention of honouring their obligations here"?
Because on the previous day I had spoken to the Icelandic finance minister, and I specifically put to him that the legislation that they had passed over the weekend in Iceland had the effect of looking after Icelandic depositors, but cutting off non-Icelandic depositors, including those in the United Kingdom. And when I said to him, "Is that what you're doing?" he said that it was. I said, "Isn't that in breach of the agreement of the European Economic Area?" And he said he didn't think so. And I have to say to Mr. Fallon, even if I was wrong on that, which I'm not, 5 weeks later they have still not they're still not treating British or non-Icelandic depositors and creditors in the same way as they are Icelandic ones. That's why I had to step in and guarantee the retail deposits of those people who put money into the Landesbanki branch, as well as, of course, I also took action in relation to Kaupthing and also Heritable, where we did something different. We transferred them to ING. But the reason we did this is because the Icelandic government, for reasons that people might understand, because they clearly that the country is in very difficult economic circumstances, but I couldn't have a situation where they simply cut off British depositors or depositors here in Britain.
But the result was a run on the Kaupthing, Singer and Friedlander UK bank, which wasn't previously in trouble, which then in turn caused the collapse of KSF Isle of Man.
That is not right. Adair Turner will talk about this, but in the week prior to the FSA closing, determining that Kaupthing could no longer meet its threshold conditions, and remember, it is the FSA that decides whether or not an institution can take deposits or not, there had been concern that there was not sufficient money in Kaupthing. That's one of the Icelandic banks. And we had understood, the authorities understood, that the money would be transferred back to Britain. That never happened. And so, I have seen reports suggesting that somehow the problems that affected Kaupthing were all the fault of the authorities here. That was not the case. I'm afraid you have to look behind this. Iceland, as is well documented now, has been having problems for some time. They decided, not us, to introduce legislation at the beginning of October to effectively be able to take over their banks. And I think that is what set in place the chain of events. What we did, and remember, it's not in the British government's interest to provoke any of this, because the net effect of this is we have had to guarantee the Landesbank depositors. We've had to transfer the depositors who were in Kaupthing and in Heritable, which is another subsidiary, to ING, but we've had to make good in the meantime the Financial Services Compensation Scheme. So we've had to expose the British taxpayer to help people in this country, and I can assure you I would not have done that if there had been any other way of doing it.
But are you aware that many of the British depositors in the Kaupthing Isle of Man Bank were originally depositors, in fact, with the Derbyshire Building Society, who are people working for British companies and British charities abroad, who are not allowed to have accounts in UK banks because they're not resident? Are you not responsible for their interests too?
Well, I think that there's two issues here. There's a specific Derbyshire interest, which I'll ask Lord Turner to deal with. in relation to people who put deposits into a jurisdiction which we are not responsible for, which includes the Isle of Man, then I don't think so. The British government's obligation must be to depositors who have put their deposits into UK banks. And the Isle of Man, for this purpose, is independent of us. It's got its own regulator.
But just before Lord Turner comes in, you did include the deposits of the Bradford and Bingley Isle of Man branch
But it was
in the deal, if I can finish,
Yeah, go on.
in the deal on the 29th of September with Abbey's Santander.
Yes,
so you rescued one lot and washed your hands of the other.
Yes, because it was part of Bradford and Bingley, whereas the Icelandic subsidiary of the Icelandic branch was actually a subsidiary of an Icelandic company, not a British company.
But I just want to be clear, you're washing your hands of the interests of British depositors
No, I'm
who
not.
happen to be working for a charity abroad but happen to have all their savings in an Isle of Man bank. You're saying you're not responsible.
My obligation as the Chancellor of the Exchequer is to people who put their money into this particular UK branch. I may say, Mr. Fowle, that legally, strictly, what we would have said to people is, look, you've got to look for your first 16,000 or so to the Icelandic authorities, because that's what the EEA agreement is. They are disputing that, as I understand it at the moment. We have said, and then we would have stood in the place between 16,000 and the 50,000 under the British Financial Service Compensation Scheme. I've gone further than that. I've said I will look after the interests of all retail depositors in a branch in London that I think we're responsible for. If you go to the next stage and say, look, you should take on the responsibility for something that is done in the Isle of Man or Guernsey, or indeed, by extension, other countries, that is quite a significant step to take. Now, there is a particular Derbyshire point, if you like, and perhaps Lord Turner would deal with that.
Well, just before he does,
Right.
the Treasury spokesman said, on Guernsey, for example, the UK government will represent the Crown dependencies in its negotiations with Iceland. So why are you washing your hands of British depositors in an Isle of Man
Because
branch?
as part of the agreement we have with Guernsey and the Isle of Man, we do, and places, act as we negotiate, because we're the sovereign state. But Mr. Fallon, Isle of Man and Guernsey operate a specific regime, and they quite deliberately, for the tax reasons and others, people choose to go in there. They're regulated by the Isle of Man authorities. Now, I would have to think long and hard, before saying for the first time that the British government would then go and underwrite savings made in another jurisdiction. It's not something that we would likely do. That said, one of the things that we've been pressing on Iceland right from the very start is they really have to go and get help from the IMF. And one of the things that I've said to them, so far as we're concerned, is we would be happy to enter into an agreement with them where we will effectively loan them the money that we're paying out just now. But you would expect, and I expect you'd be the first to criticise if I didn't do this, that we must have an agreement with the Isle of Man, with the Iceland, whereby they will pay this money back to us over a period. Now, the Netherlands are willing to do that, we're willing to do that, but it does have to be part of an agreement with the IMF, because Iceland really does need to have an accommodation with the IMF, such as the nature of its problems at the moment.
Okay, well, those questions were from Julian Williams, Dave Houghton, Klaus Eriksson and Simon Lamb, and many others came.
Could we deal with the Derbyshire point?